Keep listening to find out.
This is the Physician Philosopher podcast. I'm Dr. Jimmy Turner, an anesthesiologist, online entrepreneur, and creator of Medical Degree Financial University. The Physician Philosopher podcast teaches you how to create the life you deserve, one thought at a time. Start before you're ready. Start by starting. Start now. Hey, everyone. Welcome to episode number 79 of the Physician Philosopher podcast, where we take an uncurated and unapologetic look into physician life, money, and mindset. You might recognize that voice from the beginning. That is our dear friend, Dr. Alicia Taylor, who's hanging out for the show as is going to be kind of an ongoing thing every other week. So get used to it. We love her. You're going to love her too. But hey, Alicia, how's your week going?
It's actually going pretty well, but also super busy. I'm a resident, so my time is not my own, unfortunately, but I'm making it through.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I'm on vacation this week, believe it or not. And I kind of made a promise to myself not to do like a ton of super productive things. And naturally, I'm recording a podcast right now. But what I did for the 2 hours before this was I was detailing my car. I actually finally pulled a trigger. Anybody that's listened to me talk for a length of time knows that I'm a car guy. So I finally bought a 2015 Porsche Boxster GTS. Tons of fun to drive. But a lot of people listening are probably like, that's a terrible financial decision. And to you, I'd say you're usually right. And you know what? There's other people that are car people like me that are like in massive FOMO right now. They want a car. They've been thinking about buying a car. They feel bad about not buying a car or buying a car because people say it's a terrible financial decision. And so we're going to talk about that today, like this fear of missing out about personal finances. And in particular, this recent interest in ibonds, because it's making all the news. It's a big deal. Like I have people asking me like my kids' football games, like if I'm going to be investing in ibonds. And so, are ibonds legit or are people simply going through FOMO? But Alicia, before we dive into that, I wanted to mention that the Medical Degree Financial University is going to be opening up in June, finally. Something we've been working on for a long time behind the scenes. And as part of this, I'm actually going to be hosting a couple of live talks, live workshops to help physicians in training create cash flow. So it's going to be 2 days, June 14th and June 16th. And if you have any interest in learning about personal finance live, come into these workshops and you can learn more about that. And then, Alicia and I are going to be, heading up MDFU, which is going to be opening up just shortly after that. So make sure to join the MDFU waitlist so that you can join these workshops. It's going to have, it being MDFU, is going to have personal finance lectures, on-demand courses on entrepreneurship, money, a whole bunch of other stuff. We're going to bring in expert speakers, and there's even going to be a monthly career coaching call if you want to get an introduction to coaching. So MDFU is going to be a ridiculous value, and it's here to help those that are in training, medical students, residents, fellows, early career attendings, and actually any medical professional is welcome. So join the waitlist at thephysicianphilosopher.com/MDFU-founder. Complicated title, but the link's also in your episode notes on the description of your podcast player where you're listening. So, Alicia, today's thought is this: the fear of missing out often drives many financial decisions. And Alicia, I'm kind of curious. Have you ever had a case of financial FOMO yourself?
Yes. Oh my goodness. So many. Two come to mind, actually. One was when I was living in DC and I decided I was going to rent out this super swanky apartment because I was tired of living in a dump. And then I looked at my rent each month and realized probably that was a bad decision. I was spending way more on rent and didn't have enough money for food. So don't recommend that to any of the residents out there.
Yeah.
And then the other one was when, I was trying to be a little bit more money savvy and financial savvy. And we got our stimulus check money. Yay, residents. We get paid so little, we get stimulus check money, which is sad, but very welcome at that time. That I was trying to be a little bit better with money. And I decided that I was going to use some of that money to pay down credit card debt, and watched all my friends go shopping and take vacations. And I was really sad.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Yeah, it's case of spending FOMO. And, it's interesting because this happens all the time. Like, it wasn't, what was the last year or two when GameStop like went bonkers and like took off and everybody's like, oh, I should be investing in individual stocks and like GameStop and like the whole Twitter thing with, Elon Musk and all that stuff. And, then there's cryptocurrency, which I can't really call it like a fad or FOMO because it still exists, it's still around. People are still interested in it. But, it kind of comes and goes. And right now, everybody is talking about ibonds. I literally was at my little boy and little girl's football games. They play flag football. And I had someone come up to me and say, hey, Jimmy, are you going to be investing in ibonds? They're 9.62%. And and like I was a little taken aback by it because bonds are not something that people like really love to talk about when it comes to personal finance. And so, I thought it'd be a really interesting show. And it sounds like, I had to educate myself a little bit on this because I bonds are not something I currently have in my portfolio. But yeah, have you been hearing about I bonds too?
Oh my goodness, so much about ibonds. In a lot of these physician Facebook groups, and everyone's talking about ibonds. Have you bought your ibonds? How do we do it? How much can we buy? It's been all the craze, and I'm really glad that we have this topic today because I'm super excited to kind of dive into it and give folks maybe a more comprehensive look on what ibonds are, pros and cons, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So from the government, you can kind of buy, I don't know, a couple different kinds of bonds. So EE bonds and I bonds. And no one really talks about EE bonds because the interest rate on them is abysmal. And like nobody would, want to invest in something that's going to get like 0.1% or whatever it is. And so I bonds have kind of started making the news. And just to give this some perspective, like when I say like FOMO, like in from I think March of 2021 to March of 2022, like that 12-month period, $11 billion was invested in I bonds. And if you look at, excuse me, the 6-month period, $11 billion was invested in I bonds. And then if you look at the year before that, it was 1 billion. So we've gone from 1 billion during a 6-month period to 11 billion the following year during the same 6-month period. And so this has become like everybody's doing it sort of thing, right? And so I thought it was interesting because you actually taught me this when we were talking about the show idea. And I was like, hey, I want to research this idea because I don't really invest in I bonds. I want to learn more about it. It sounds like everybody's doing it. And you're like, Jimmy, what, you think I bonds are a good idea? Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about how I bonds work and maybe, you know, why it may not be a great idea or maybe why it is. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, let's talk about it. All right, so I bonds, for those who are not aware, I bonds are inflation protected bonds. So let's go from very large view. So a bond is when you are loaning somebody money and they're paying you back with interest. So when people talk about, oh, I'm going to buy a bond, it usually means they're going to loan either the government or some company or some state money, and that money is going to be paid back to them in interest. And the note that you get that they're going to pay back your money with interest is called a bond, right? So a bond is when you're loaning somebody money. And there's different kinds of bonds that you can have, right? So you can take out a bond or loan money to the federal government. And those are like treasury bonds or governmental bonds or federal bonds, if you will, right? You can loan money to the state that you live in. So I live in Georgia. Jimmy lives in North Carolina. We could each loan money to our state, right? And those are a separate kind of bond. You can loan money to a corporation or a private company, and those are, corporate bonds. So there's different kinds of bonds that you can take out. And historically, when you're loaning somebody money in the form of a bond, the interest rate or the profit that you make is a lot lower than the profit that you would make if you invested in a stock. And so in most people's portfolio, they have a combination of stocks and bonds. And in this particular episode, we're focusing on a different type of bond. And so all the craze lately has been on I bonds or inflation protected bonds. So what is that? That's a type of federal bond. So you're loaning money to the federal government and they're saying, hey, we're going to pay you back with interest. The interesting thing about I bonds is that the interest amount changes. So the interest amounts, the amount that the federal government is going to pay you back as a profit for loaning them the money in the first place, is called interest. And that interest changes. So let's say you loan the government $1,000, right? The amount of interest or profit that you're going to make for loaning them that money changes, and it changes based on inflation. So lately inflation has gone crazy high, right? The cost of cars has increased, the cost of houses have increased, and so inflation has increased. And so because inflation has increased, the amount of interest that you're making on these bonds has increased. So, a few years ago, maybe somebody would loan somebody money to the federal government, and maybe the interest rate on that money would be 1%, 2%. Well, now because inflation has skyrocketed, the interest that you can get on those bonds is like 8 or 9%, right? And that is why everyone is all the craze about inflation protected bonds or I bonds. They're like, oh my goodness, I used to only be able to make 1% or 2% on my money, and now I can make 8 or 9% on my money. Oh my goodness, I should invest in that. And then, of course, they compare it to their stock portfolio, and we all know stocks have dipped lately. So they're logging into their Vanguard accounts, they're logging into Fidelity, and they're seeing that the whole value of their, retirement account has decreased dramatically. And then they go on Facebook and they hear about I bonds, and people are making 8 or 9% on their money, and they're like, wait a minute, maybe I should invest in that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's, I find it funny because, the amount of times you say interest, right? It's interesting that interest-based I bonds, which are interest bonds. So it's like a little bit hard to keep up with, but like it really is. It's a fascinating thing. And, so really, really helpful to like walk through like the different kinds of bonds there, right? So for all the way from like the most secure kind of, governmental bonds that you can purchase to like junk bonds on companies that are super high risk, right? So like just because you think bonds, you don't have to think necessarily safer or lower potential income, although at various times that's true. But we're talking about federal government bonds. So like they're backed by the federal government. And so, if you just back up and like make this really big picture and you hear people saying, wait, you can guarantee 9.62% for the next 6 months and it's backed by the federal government. I mean, if the federal government fails, like you didn't need to be investing in stocks or bonds. You need to be buying like guns, ammunition, water, canned food. I mean, like, if the government fails, we're in big trouble, right? And so it's one of the safest things that you can invest in because it is governmentally backed. But that's only if you don't dive in below the surface, right? Where what you talked about, which is that this interest rate that they're offering is based on two things. There's a fixed rate and an interest rate that's based on inflation. And so these inflation-based bonds that produces interest, in this case, the fixed rate is zero. And all of the rate that you're getting from these I bonds is coming from the consumer price index, the CPI-based inflation, right? And so that's where the 9.62% is that people are talking about right now. It's coming from the inflation side of things. And because inflation, like you're talking about, Alicia, is so bad right now, it's so high. Of course, these bonds are going to be offering quite a bit, back in return because that is a marker or a sign that inflation's been really high. Now, it's interesting though because as we were talking about this before the show, we're planning out our episodes. You kind of mentioned this idea that you're not really earning any real money. So let's talk about that because I think that's a really important like thing to consider and to realize.
Yeah. So when you had mentioned I bonds, you were feeling like you had missed out because you hadn't yet invested in I bonds.
FOMO.
And I was like, I don't think you missed that at all. And you had this puzzled look on your face. And so let's talk about it. So with I bonds, the craze is that you are keeping up with inflation. So as inflation increases, then the interest that you're making on your money increases, right? But you got to keep in mind that it's keeping up with inflation. And so if all you're doing with your money is keeping up with inflation, you have not increased your purchasing power, right? If something was worth $100 last year and inflation is 9%, then that means that you would have to pay $109 today to purchase that same item. And if you had bought an I bond, $100 worth, and then because of inflation, the interest on that I bond has made it now worth $109, you haven't gained any real money. You still have the exact same purchasing power. And so when you account for inflation, the real return on I bonds is zero because you're just keeping up with inflation. You are not exceeding inflation.
And that's because the fixed rate that the government has set right now is zero. So if they ever increase the fixed rate in addition to the inflation-based portion, then you could potentially make money even with inflation. But right now it's zero, right?
Yeah, the fixed rate is zero, and it's not like the fixed rate ever goes up to like 4 or 5%. The fixed rate, the fixed rate has been zero for some time. It usually stays around 0.5, right? And so I think it's really important to really do a deep dive and say, wait a minute, people are saying I can make 9% on my money. That sounds really great. But if inflation is also 9%, you haven't really gained any real money because your purchasing power is the exact same. So, that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah. So as we kind of think through this, right? If someone wanted to invest in I bonds, there are the basics like, you can put $10,000 in per year. And if you're married, you can do $10,000 for your spouse as well. And then you would be getting 9.62%, which is kind of locked in until November at least. And so they basically get locked in for, I think, 6-month periods at a time. And so
That's
even
right.
if the reset went to zero before that, like you'd still be getting your 9.62%. And theoretically, if it went to zero, like you'd take the average of that, it'd be 4.81%, and honestly, like putting $10,000 in something, getting a guaranteed almost 5% return on your money, regardless of what happens to inflation, like theoretically, it's going to come back down to the 2 to 3% it usually is. I mean, we don't know. It could stay at 9 or 10 or whatever. And if you look at historical numbers on inflation, like it gets kind of scary because there are some years where it's like off the charts, so, but you don't really know. So if you wanted to, you could do $10,000. And so let's talk about what would the pros be? Like, what would the benefit of this be if somebody wanted to, I don't know, invest in I bonds, right? They have the $10,000. They're thinking about doing it. What are some potential benefits? We've already talked about some of them, like it's inflation adjusted,
Mhm.
right? So you don't make any money, but at the same time, when stocks are doing poor and inflation is high, you're actually making more money than you would with stocks. And so it's inflation adjusted. So it's a good hedge against that if you want to think about inflation. And then we mentioned also that it's pretty much a guaranteed return because it is the federal government that's
Right.
backing these things. So if they can't pay, we've got bigger problems. Are there any other pros or benefits that you'd see to keep an eye bonds around?
Yeah, I want to make it clear. It's not like I think I bonds are useless. I think that they have I think that they have value, right? So I think if you're someone who has a large sum of money that you are saving for a rainy day for 5 or 10 years from now. Let's say you're saving up for a down payment on a home, right? And you were originally going to save up that money in cash. Maybe I bonds would actually be a great avenue for that because it's going to allow your money to increase with inflation. So your purchasing power is going to stay the same, right? But your money is going to increase with inflation, and then you get a guaranteed return because it's backed by the federal government. And so, in that instance, I think it would be great to invest in I bonds, right? Because your alternative is just having the money sit in cash and lose
Mhm.
9% of its purchasing power each year. And so, when you compare, do I want this money just sitting in cash, or do I want to be able to have this money keep up with inflation? Then I think I bonds is great. And so, if you're saving up for a down payment on a house, if you're saving up for a large purchase, I actually think I bonds would be a great purchase in this scenario.
Yeah, that's actually a really good way to think about it, Alicia. That I hadn't really, gotten to that yet because from a long term standpoint, comparing it against investing in stocks, which over a longer period of time are likely to do much better, um, and then keeping it in cash, like obviously you're losing money, but like that intermediate scenario. So I guess what I mean is, we're actually going to talk about something next episode, the pros and cons of emergency funds and whether doctors should even have one. So stay tuned for that. It'll be out in a couple of weeks. But when you think about, okay, so we're not, not maybe great for an emergency fund. We'll get to the reasons why it's not good for that, for like immediate use. It's not really great for long-term investing potentially because you're not keeping up with what stocks will likely do. But that medium situation, that middle ground that you just described, is a really kind of interesting niche for it, right? You're saving up for that down payment on the house, and you don't want the money to be at risk in the market because it could go down, but you also don't want it losing to inflation. And so, yeah, that's actually a pretty niche use for I bonds. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think in that scenario, it would be fantastic. Someone who's saving up to, buy into a practice would be great. Someone who's saving up to buy a car, someone who's saving up for a wedding, anything that you're saving up for, like a very large purchase, I think I bonds would be great.
So I should have bought I bonds before I got the Porsche.
I mean, it would maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Hey, well, one other benefit too is that these things are state income tax free, is my understanding on them. And so, um, but are there any more benefits you want to mention before I start hammering away on this thing?
um, I think we've hit mainly like the top ones, and we'll talk about some other ones later. But let's get into this next part.
Yeah, because well, so you mentioned state income tax free, or I mentioned this that's the case,
Yes.
but then it immediately has to be followed by a but. It is
Yes.
taxed at your marginal federal tax rate, which, as an attending physician, I can tell you does not excite me very much. Like when I know that I can invest in the market and in stocks and then get long-term capital gains because it's invested in the market. Like these things are invested directly with the federal government and the treasury. And so because of that, it comes with a whole slew of kind of potential, I don't know, cons that you need to consider. And one of them is that you're taxed at the federal tax rate. I mean, that's not honestly, that appealing to me. I'm like, great, I'm keeping up with inflation, but then I'm gonna get hammered when I get taxed on these things at the back end.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I'm so glad that you brought that up. I think oftentimes people focus solely on the pros of buying I bonds. It's going to keep up with inflation. I can earn 9% on my money, but they don't think about the cons. Maybe they're just not aware of the cons. And the two ones that I really think of are taxes and liquidity problems.
Mhm.
So by taxes, I mean the amount of money in taxes that you're going to have to pay, and liquidity meaning when can you get your money out if you were to need your money. And so let's talk about taxes real quick. So you are absolutely correct. If you buy I bonds, you are exempt from paying state and local taxes on the money that you make, which sounds great. But you still have to pay federal taxes. And I think that that's something that maybe is sometimes overlooked. You have to pay federal taxes on the interest that you make on that money. So let's think about it real quick. If you were to, put $10,000 in I bonds and you were to make 9% on your money, which is the current interest rate, that's fantastic, but then you've got to pay taxes on the interest that you made. And so when you talk about what's my real benefit, what's my real profit? Well, if you just caught up with inflation, you haven't really earned any real money. You've just caught up with inflation. And now you got to pay taxes on that money. So actually, you've kind of lost some purchasing power there. And so I think oftentimes folks forget about that. And I know it can kind of get a little bit into the weeds, but remember, you got to pay federal taxes on the interest that you make.
Yeah, and I think that's important because and again, we're going to try to avoid the weeds on the show. If you want to learn about the weeds, you can come to, you can come inside MDFU and we'll answer every question you have because it's kind of hard to do this on a large format like this. And we want to answer your questions, but we want to be able to do them justice. But when you think about marginal versus effective tax rates, right? Like my effective tax rate isn't massive. It's like 25, maybe 28%, something like that. But my
Mm-hmm.
marginal tax rate is well above 30.
Right.
And so like you're talking about the dollars on the margin, the periphery, the very last dollar that gets taxed. And when you bring this money home, that's the kind of tax you're talking about. And so like now it's like, okay, great. So my $100 turned into $109, but that $9, I'm going to lose a third of it. Right. So it's really $6, right? So you're really getting 6%. And, for me in my situation, if you live in, I mean, I guess a different tax bracket, you could have a different tax situation naturally, right? But for me, like it's going to be, a third of the money is going to go away in terms of it being taxed. Now you compare that to my capital gains tax rate when I hold on to something for long-term capital gains for a year, it's like 15, right? And so, and if you don't take out more than like 80, it's zero. And so it's really interesting depending on what your adjusted gross income is, I should say for capital gains tax. But 15 compared to 33 or whatever it is, I'd have to go back and look at my taxes for this most recent year. But that's a big difference. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, and this you might have a different perspective on this, Leisha, because of where we are in our journeys. But for me, like investing $10,000 a year into my portfolio isn't really going to move the needle massively in terms of like what my asset allocation is. And as your portfolio gets larger and larger and larger, if you have $1 million portfolio and you're talking about investing $10,000 in bonds, right, that's like 1% of your portfolio. And so, it's not really a large significant number. And so in order to move the number in terms of bond allocation, you would end up having to buy I bonds in addition to other kinds of bonds, just to do that. And to be clear, like Leisha mentioned at the beginning of this, I bonds are not the same as all bonds. Like we're not saying all bonds fit into the categories of the things we're discussing. We're talking about I bonds specifically. But yeah, like for me, like when I started learning about this, as you pointed them out, I was like, yeah, this is not something that I really have a huge desire. And in addition to all those taxes, like you got to deal with the clunky website, like the federal government, website's impossible to deal with. That's not impossible. It's harsh. It's challenging to deal with. If you have to hold them for at least a year. If you hold them for less than 5, then you lose the last 3 months of interest. And so there are all these rules associated with not only getting an I bond, like you can't just walk into a bank and buy them. Like you have to use their website, which is challenging. And then when you take them out, there are all these rules that make it, not really particularly helpful, in redeeming them.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just to recap on those things. So, yeah, I mean, if federal taxes was not enough, you also are capped on how much you can actually purchase, right? So each person can purchase only a maximum of $10,000 in I bonds. You can add in another 5,000 if you get a tax refund, which a lot of doctors are not getting. So maybe now that's applicable. If you have a business, you can do another $10,000 for your business. So if you have a separate EIN number, then you can do another 10,000. But I love what you said there is like you're capped on how much you can actually purchase. And so when you think about its overall effect on your investment portfolio, it's minimal. And then it adds, taxes that you have to pay. There's the time challenges of actually trying to figure out how to work the website and hoping it doesn't crash on you. And then, as you mentioned here on that last part, you have some issues with when you can take the money out. So usually with a bond, like if you were to buy like tips, which is another kind of bond, so treasury inflation protected securities, if you were to buy tips, then you can cash out those bonds immediately. With I bonds, that's not the case. You actually have to hold the I bond for at least a year, right? So if you spend all of your extra money, use your emergency fund to invest in I bonds, you can't take out that money for an entire year. So you better hope that you don't need that money back in the year because you cannot get it out of that I bond. And then if you hold the I bond for fewer than 5 years, you actually forfeit 3 months of interest. So if you invest in I bonds because you're following what everyone else is doing, right? And then inflation decreases, well, one, you can't take the I bond out before 12 months. And two, if you take it out before 5 years, you've lost some interest. And then you got to pay federal taxes on the amount of money that you make. So really make sure that you are absolutely certain that you want I bonds before you just kind of just say, oh, I can earn 9% on my money. Let me purchase I bonds. Don't forget about these other things.
Yeah. And so I guess if we had to answer the fundamental question about, when it might be appropriate for people to consider I bonds, because, we're going to say this all the time, but personal finance is personal, right? And so, there are specific situations where it might make sense. And hopefully, with the knowledge you have now based on listening to the show, you might know if that's right for you. But after having this conversation, for me, like the one really kind of niche place that it kind of makes sense is what you mentioned about, buying a down payment on a house or buying a car or buying into a practice, so long as you don't need to do any of those things in less than 12 months, right? So if you're putting your $10,000 in, right, to buy a house, like you better not buy the house in 11 months because you can't get the money back, right? And so not great for an emergency fund because it's not available for 12 months, not great for necessarily long-term investing because stocks are likely to outperform them, particularly given that the fixed rate is zero. So this is only based on inflation. Your real purchasing power, as Alicia would call it, is the same. And so really that niche that you mentioned earlier, I guess that for me is kind of the big take home for people. If you're in that unique situation, then maybe I bonds make a little more sense. What do you think, Leisha?
I totally agree. And I was on Facebook and I was listening or not listening. I was reading folks' replies and comments, and it was interesting because someone had said, "Well, I'm just going to put money in I bonds, and then I'll cash them out after a year, and I'll put that money in stocks. I mean, stocks are going down right now, so I'm just going to invest in I bonds because I bonds are what's the new thing right now, and then I'll cash that out and I'll invest in stocks." And I wanted to say that to me is trying to time the market. And as
Mm.
we know, you cannot try to time the market and do it very well. And folks who get lucky oftentimes don't get lucky again. And so I would really caution folks against doing that because I've heard and seen a lot of folks kind of, saying I bonds is what I'll invest in now. And then I'll switch back to stocks later. And we all know trying to time the market, a lot of folks have tried and failed.
Yeah, I could not yeah, endorse that further. Time in the market, not timing the market is the key, right? And
Yes.
so yeah, perfect. Well, I think this is really helpful, Alicia, to discuss and kind of to bring in front of people. And it is a little more, in the weeds than maybe we might get most weeks on this show. But it's all the rage right now. And so I feel like it was a really, great topic to discuss and one that you and I were super excited about. So today's thought for this episode was this: the fear of missing out often drives many financial decisions. So if you're considering buying I bonds, make sure it's not because of FOMO and it's because of the facts. And if you fit into those unique situations where you might make sense for you. And don't forget to sign up for MDFU, the wait list. You can do that and find out when the doors are opening, get the unique founding members price, in addition to all the other stuff that we offer in there, where Alicia and I are going to be teaching you each week about personal finance for medical professionals. So that's at thephysicianphilosopher.com/MDFU-founder. That link, just click the episode description. It'll be right there for you to click. So until next time, my friends, start before you're ready. Start by starting. Start now. We'll see you next week.